Welcome to Sci-Fi Travelers, friends. In today's episode, we'll be listening to the story of Owen and Seraphina. Sit back and get ready to dive into the adventure. Enjoy the show. The Meridian had been drifting for 11 days, which was 10 days longer than Owen liked anything to drift, including conversations, elevators, and the occasional romance. Out here, past the last charted buoy where the stars thinned to a scattering of tired sparks, the research vessel wandered along on failing systems and stubborn hope, neither of which Owen fully trusted anymore. He was the ship's engineer, a man who hummed without knowing he did it, and fixed things nobody else could be bothered to understand. At present, he was on his back beneath the reactor housing, arm buried to the elbow in a coolant conduit that had, in his professional opinion, gone sulky. "Bishop," he said to the ceiling, "remind me why we sailed off the edge of the map." "Scientific curiosity," the navigation AI replied smoothly. "Also a clerical error. The two are frequently indistinguishable." Owen grunted and shoved harder against a seized panel behind the coolant line. It resisted, then gave all at once, the way stubborn things do right when you've committed your whole shoulder to the effort. His hand plunged into the dark cavity beyond and closed around something that did not belong there. Not a bolt, not a tool. Something small, smooth, and cold enough to prickle his palm like a fistful of winter. He drew it out into the low red light. It was a journal, if a journal could be carved from frost. No larger than his hand, faceted like a shard of ice given the polite shape of a book, its surface catching the glow and throwing it back in pale, shifting colors. He turned it over, frowning. Then his thumb brushed the cover, and the thing woke. Light spooled up from within the crystal, thin and silver, arranging itself into letters that assembled and dissolved and assembled again, as though the pages were remembering how to speak. Owen nearly dropped it. He did drop his wrench, which clanged off the deck with theatrical enthusiasm. That, Bishop observed, did not sound like a bolt. It wasn't a bolt. How exciting! Or alarming! I lack the sensors to distinguish, and frankly, so do you. Owen didn't answer. He'd gone very still, because across the engine bay, in the doorway that led up toward the bridge, a figure stood watching him. Pale as winter frost, luminous in the dimness. Two long ears sweeping back from her temples like the ship itself had grown quiet enough to listen. Seraphina. Silver eyes fixed on the glowing thing in his hands, saying nothing at all. The reactor hummed. Neither of them moved. She was gone before he could stammer an explanation, dissolving back up the corridor toward the bridge with the silent grace of someone who had never once tripped over a cable in her life. Owen sat there a moment longer, the frost-carved journal still glowing in his palm, feeling as though he'd been caught doing something wrong despite having done nothing but exist near a coolant panel. "She saw me holding it," he said. "She did," Bishop agreed. "Would you like me to fabricate an alibi? I'm quite good. Last month I convinced Captain Cooper the missing rations were consumed by atmospheric shrinkage. That's not a real thing. He believed it. Belief is the only currency that matters, Owen. He knew what he should do. He should carry the thing straight up to the bridge, set it on the console, and say, 'I believe this is yours,' like a decent person. He knew this the way one knows one ought to eat vegetables and go to bed at a reasonable hour. Instead, he stayed exactly where he was, on his back beneath a grumpy reactor at the edge of charted space, and let his thumb drift once more across the crystal. The light unspooled. Letters gathered themselves out of the glow, delicate and precise, and Owen, who had every intention of stopping after a single line, began to read. It belonged to Seraphina. Of course it did. The ship's stellar cartographer, the pale, silent woman who mapped dead stars and drank her tea scalding enough to strip paint and watched the whole crew with those quiet silver eyes. The early entries were tidy things, clinical almost. Notes on the Meridian's slow decay, on the peculiar drift pulling them further off course each day, on gravitational readings she clearly trusted more than she trusted the people around her. Beautiful handwriting, terrible small talk, even on paper. "You've gone quiet," Bishop noted. "In my experience, that means you're either concentrating or making a mistake. Again, no censor for it." "I'll stop after this page," Owen murmured. "You said that about the airlock." He had, in fact, said that about the airlock. 3 years ago. 5 minutes, he'd promised the captain. The airlock still whistled a mournful little tune whenever they hit hard vacuum, and the crew had named it Gerald. Owen turned the glowing page anyway, telling himself this was different, telling himself he was only being thorough, only checking for anything relevant to their predicament. The next entry was not about dead stars. It was about him, and that was where Owen, against every reasonable instinct he possessed, entirely forgot to stop. The engineer hums while he works. The entry began. A different song, each shift. None of them finished, none of them in tune. I have tried to catalog the pattern. There is no pattern. It is irregular, warm, and impossible to chart. Owen read it twice. Then a third time because the first two hadn't quite landed. The way a wave you're not braced for tends to knock you sideways. He was aware of his own face doing something undignified. Somewhere in his chest, a mechanism he'd long assumed rusted shut gave an experimental turn. She had noticed. Not just noticed, studied him, with the same grave attention she gave to collapsing suns, and found him worth a line of that beautiful, precise handwriting. He pretends not to see me on the bridge, another entry observed. He is extraordinarily bad at pretending. Yesterday he greeted a bulkhead. I did not greet a bulkhead, Owen said aloud, wounded. You absolutely greeted a bulkhead, Bishop said. Tuesday, you said oh hey to it and then apologized. I have it logged. I can play the audio at the next crew dinner if you'd like to relive the moment socially. Why would you keep that? I keep everything. I'm a navigation system. Storage is the one thing I have in abundance, along with opinions. Owen sank lower against the reactor housing, ears going hot, feeling profoundly and specifically caught, not by a person, but by a book, which was somehow worse, because a book could not be talked out of what it had already recorded. He thought of Seraphina in the doorway an hour ago, silver eyes on the journal, saying nothing. She'd known exactly what he might read, and she'd walked away anyway, leaving the frost and the glow and the confession in his hands like something set down on purpose. That thought was too large to hold, so he set it aside. The reactor gave a contented purr as the coolant finally circulated true, warmth threading back through the conduit under his palm. Owen realized, distantly, that he'd been humming again, some aimless half-tune, the kind she'd written about, and that the sound of it filled the bay and drifted, no doubt, up the corridor toward the bridge, where two very long ears were surely angled to catch it. He stopped. Then, feeling foolish, he started again, softer this time, wondering if she was listening. Your heart rate, Bishop remarked pleasantly, is elevated in a manner consistent with either romance or minor cardiac distress. I lack the sensors to distinguish. It's romance, Owen admitted, to a ceiling, a glowing book, and a nosy machine. Ah, said Bishop. How inconvenient. We're rather busy dying out here. Bishop was, unfortunately, correct about the dying part. Owen might have stayed lost in the journal for another hour, tracing lines about his humming and his terrible pretending, had his thumb not slipped past the tender entries into something colder. Buried among Seraphina's charts, folded into the crystal like a secret within a secret, was a warning. She had written it weeks ago and told no one. The meridian had not simply drifted. It had wandered into the edge of a current, a slow river running through the dark, and that river ran only one way, outward, away from every star anyone had ever named. He read the calculations 3 times. They did not improve with acquaintance. Bishop, he said, sitting up so fast his skull met the reactor housing with a noise like a struck bell. The drift. It's not random. Correct. I've suspected for some time. I mentioned it on day 4. You did not. I did. You were humming. You greeted a bulkhead shortly after. I chose not to compete for your attention. Owen took the journal and the sting on his scalp and went up to the bridge, where Captain Cooper stood frowning at a star field that had grown noticeably emptier over 11 days. Owen explained the current, the outward pull, the vanishing margin, while carefully omitting how he'd learned it, which required inventing a heroic tale about reading the coolant readouts very closely, with great engineering intuition. Cooper, who trusted Owen considerably more than the situation warranted, nodded gravely and ordered a burn to break them free of the flow. The reactor, so recently coaxed back to purring, took this as a personal insult. It flared, sputtered, and dropped to half power with the wounded dignity of a cat asked to perform a trick. "Burn aborted," Bishop announced. "On the bright side, we are now drifting stylishly." "There is no bright side," Cooper said. "There is always a bright side. It's simply very far away and receding at current velocity." Across the bridge, calm amid the alarms and the flickering consoles, Seraphina stood at her cartography station, silver eyes lifted from the dead stars to Owen's face. She did not look frightened. She looked, if anything, like a woman watching a thing arrive that she had seen coming for a long while. And Owen understood two things at once, standing there with her frost-carved confession warm in his pocket. She had known about the current for weeks, and in all that time, knowing the ship was being drawn toward the end of every map, she had kept writing faithfully about the way he hummed. The woman, he thought, had priorities. He wasn't sure whether to be terrified or touched. He settled, uneasily, on both. The bridge emptied slowly as the crisis settled into the long, dull ache that all crises eventually become. Cooper went to argue with the reactor in person, which never worked, but seemed to comfort him. Owen retreated to a quiet corner where the emergency lights washed everything in tired red, and there, against every good instinct, he opened the journal to its final entries. The tone had changed. He noticed it the way you notice weather shift, a pressure, a hush. The early pages had been all instruments and angles, a woman measuring the universe at arm's length. But near the end, Seraphina had begun to write about smaller things, about hoping and how unbearable an ordinary thing it turned out to be. "I have spent my whole life measuring distances," one entry read. "It is what I am good at. It is, perhaps, all I am good at." Then, a few lines down, quieter. "He is the first distance I do not wish to keep." Owen set the journal on his knee and stared at the dead star field for a while. "You've stopped humming," Bishop observed. "This is either profound emotional depth or a systems failure. I'll assume the former, as I've grown fond of you and would prefer you not be broken. I'm fine. You are demonstrably not fine. Your posture has collapsed into what I can only describe as a man who has read something." He turned the last page. And there, near the bottom, set apart from everything else, were 3 words. Plain, unadorned, written in that careful hand that weighed every syllable like precious ore mined from a difficult vein. Coming from anyone else, they might have meant little. Coming from Seraphina, who rationed words the way the ship now rationed power, they were catastrophic. Owen read them once. Then he did the thing he'd promised himself he'd stop doing and read them again, to be certain the glow hadn't rearranged itself into something kinder or less enormous. It had not. The words held. That was, he was learning, the great inconvenience of true things. They refused to blink first. The engines hummed on beneath him, dragging the meridian toward the edge of every chart at a stately, unhurried pace, and the whole immense dark seemed suddenly to fold itself down small, down past the corridors, past the sulky reactor, down to the size of one glowing page and one man who did not know where to put his hands. "For what it's worth," Bishop said gently, "I have run the numbers, and the odds of you saying something sensible when you next see her are quite poor." "Thanks. I could write you a script. I did one for Gerald the airlock once. It didn't take, but Gerald appreciated the effort." Owen almost laughed. He didn't quite manage it, because a shadow had fallen across the red light, and he knew, before he looked up, that he was no longer alone. She was standing in the doorway. Owen didn't know how long she'd been there. Long enough, was the answer. Long enough to see the glow on his face, to see which page he'd reached, to see him read those 3 words twice, like a man checking a wound to see if it was real. Her silver eyes moved from his face to the journal open on his knee and back again, unhurried, and Owen experienced the very particular horror of being caught reading someone's soul aloud inside his own head. He opened his mouth. Nothing arrived. The words that had seemed so enormous on the page had, in the presence of their author, packed a bag and fled. "Shall I give you two some privacy?" Bishop offered. with the delicacy of a wrench dropped from a great height. I can pretend to power down. I do it convincingly. Observe. Powering down. There. You'd never know I was listening to everything. Neither of them so much as glanced at the ceiling. But something in Seraphina's frost-pale face eased, a fraction, the smallest thaw at the corner of her mouth, there and gone, the way a distant star flickers and makes you doubt you saw it at all. She crossed the deck toward him. Slowly, the way she did everything, as though even walking were a measurement to be taken with care. Owen stood because it seemed wrong to receive this sitting down and clutched the journal, and then realized clutching it was perhaps the worst possible thing to be doing with his hands, and clutched it harder out of panic. I wasn't going to read it, he said. That's a lie. I read all of it. I read the part about the bulkhead. In my defense, the bulkhead started it. She said nothing. She was very close now, and the silence between them had gone strange, dense, humming, louder somehow than the failing engines, louder than the current dragging them past the last edge of everything charted. It was the loudest quiet Owen had ever stood inside. He held the journal out to her, an offering, an apology, a small crystalline surrender. She did not take it. Instead, she reached past it, past the frost and the glow and the confession, and took his hand. Her fingers were cool against his, cool as the journal had been that first moment beneath the coolant panel. And Owen felt something enormous and mathematical resolve itself in his chest, some equation he hadn't known he was solving. She had spent her whole life measuring distances, and here, at the end of the map, with the dark pulling them nowhere and everywhere, she had simply stopped measuring. He understood dizzily that some distance is close only when both people agree at once to stop counting the space between them. "Hi," Owen said. It was not sensible. Bishop had warned him. But her fingers tightened around his, and it turned out to be exactly enough. They broke the current together, in the end, though it took all three of them to manage it. Her charts, his stubborn reactor, and Bishop reading out numbers with the tense good cheer of a machine that had quietly grown fond of being alive. Seraphina found the seam in the flow. There was a place, she explained, laying her cool fingers over the console beside his, where the outward river thinned enough to slip a burn through sideways, a window measured in seconds, threaded to 3 impossible decimals. Owen coaxed the sulky reactor up past every limit it had, whispering to it the way Cooper whispered, which he'd always mocked and now understood was simply love applied to machinery. "Window in 10, Bishop announced. 9, 8. I'd like to say, in case this fails, that you have both been adequate crewmates and one of you greeted a bulkhead. I regret nothing." "Burn on my mark," Owen said, and Seraphina's hand stayed over his, and at mark the meridian screamed and shuddered and wrenched sideways out of the dark river into open, ordinary black. For a long moment, nobody breathed. Then the starfield outside grew crowded again. Real stars, charted stars, the tired, familiar sparks of a galaxy that had a map. They were pointed home. "We're free," Cooper said from the doorway, stunned. "Owen, how did you—" "Engineering intuition," Owen said. "He read a magic diary," Bishop corrected. "It's a whole thing. I have the audio." Cooper decided, wisely, not to ask. Later, days later, with the reactor purring true and Gerald the airlock whistling his mournful tune at every hatch cycle, Owen found Seraphina at her station with a new journal open before her. Not frost this time. Ordinary paper. She was writing, and when he approached, she did not close it, did not angle it away, did not fix him with a warning silver stare. She turned it toward him instead. "Read as I write," the gesture said. He'd spent this whole voyage learning her language. He understood it now. On the first page, in that careful hand that weighed each syllable like precious ore, she had recorded a single observation that the engineer had finally learned the words to the song he was always humming. It was true. He knew them now. Had known them, he supposed, since a cool hand closed over his at the edge of every map. He began to hum it, off-key as ever, warm, impossible to chart. And Seraphina, Pale as winter frost, her two long ears tilting toward the sound, hummed it back to him, quiet and sure, the two of them charting a course no instrument had ever dared to draw, all the way home and somewhere further after that. Some distances aren't measured in light years. They're measured in the space between two people who keep pretending not to notice each other, the words left unwritten, the confessions wedged behind coolant panels of our own making. Owen crossed the entire edge of charted space, but the hardest distance he ever closed was the one to a doorway he could have walked through any day. And maybe that's the question worth sitting with tonight. What have you left unsaid? Whose journal, in a sense, have you been afraid to read, or afraid to let someone read? How many currents have quietly pulled us off course while we hummed and greeted bulkheads, waiting for a braver moment that we could have simply chosen? We spend so much of our lives measuring the space between ourselves and the people we long for. Perhaps love, in the end, is just the courage to stop counting. The end. Friends, we've reached the end of Seraphina and Owen's story. I hope you enjoyed it. Before we go, I have a small request. Please hit the like button, leave your thoughts about the story in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more science fiction stories. The next story will be released very soon. See you in the next story, friends.